Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all very much for joining us today. My name is Will Barbie, and I'm the president of the Buckley Institute. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's conversation with Mr. Coleman Hughes for a talk entitled The End of Race Politics. Before I introduce our guest, I would like to say a few words about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is the flagship program of the Buckley Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates. Thank you very much. Mic issues. Good to go? Thank you. Let me start over. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is the flagship program of the Buckley Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 750 Buckley Fellows hold a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website at buckleyinstitute.com. I also would like to emphasize the Buckley program's commitment to freedom of speech. Disruption of an event is not consistent with Yale's policies on free expression as outlined in the Woodward Report. I would ask that each of you respect the right of our speaker to be heard and the right of your fellow audience members to listen to the event. Thank you again for joining us in upholding the values of free speech. Now for our guest. Coleman Hughes is an author, podcaster, and opinion columnist who specializes in issues related to race, public policy, and applied ethics. Hughes' writing has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Review, The Spectator, and many more. In 2019, he garnered attention after testifying before the U.S. House Judiciary Committee at a hearing on reparations for slavery, arguing against the proposal. He has appeared on prominent TV shows and podcasts, including The View, Real Time with Bill Maher, The Joe Rogan Experience, and Making Sense with Sam Harris. And he was also featured on Forbes' 30 Under 30 list in 2021. Last year, Hughes released his first book, The End of Race Politics, Arguments for a Colorblind America, which we will be discussing today. He currently serves as a columnist at the Free Press and a contributor at CNN. Please join me in welcoming Coleman Hughes to Buckley Institute and to Yale. Thanks very much. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, of course. So the way this will work is we'll just sort of begin with some broader questions related to the topics presented in The End of Race Politics. We'll go for about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to the audience so that you all will be able to ask your questions to Mr. Hughes. So if I may begin, I would just sort of like to ask about your sort of trajectory, your personal experiences that have led you to thinking the way that you do about race, about politics, because obviously, the ideas presented in your book, many, it goes against perhaps the popular trends of today. And so I'm just curious about what sort of personal edifications or experiences you've had that have led you to think the way that you do.
Yeah, so I was born in '96 in a town called Montclair, New Jersey, just outside of New York. It's a liberal town and a multiracial town. It has a reputation for the kind of town that mixed race couples move to and gay couples move to because it's very accepting and progressive. And I grew up in the 2000s and 2010s with the default understanding of race that fell out of the civil rights movement and out of Martin Luther King's great speeches, which is to say, your race is not who you are. You should never treat anyone differently because of their race. And what matters is what's on the inside. That's what I grew up believing. That's what pretty much everyone around me believed. And on the rare occasion that somebody did say or do something racist, it was the exception that proved the rule, and the whole rest of the community reinforced the MLK ethic, for lack of a better term. So that's how I was raised. And then something very strange and interesting started to happen around 2012. I was I think a sophomore in high school, and my school sent me, offered to send me on something called the People of Color Retreat. And I just said yes to it because they were basically offering for me to miss 3 days of class with absences excused. So I was like, sign me up. And so it was about, several hundred, maybe 1,000 private school kids from all around the country gathered in Houston and learned what I didn't know at the time, but would later learn was called critical race theory and intersectionality. So it was there where I first learned terms like systemic racism, internalized racism, these kind of boutique concepts I'd never heard before, but white privilege as well, things that would become very sort of popular in the culture only a few years later. And for the first time in my life when I was at this place, racial identity was discussed very differently. It was, instead of your race being an irrelevant part of who you are, and what matters is your values, what you bring to the table, what's on the inside. Instead, racial identity was like a kind of magic. It was, to be a person of color was discussed. It almost, you were made to feel like the opening scene in Harry Potter, when he discovers he's not just a normal person, he's a wizard, right? And so if you're basically anything but white, your race was spoken of that way. And I thought it was a very new and very strange way to look at race, but I thought, this is interesting. That was an interesting little 3-day detour into this other way of thinking. Now back to real life. Then I got to Columbia University a few years later, and by that time, the whole culture had absorbed this way of thinking about race, so that to question it was something that had to be done with great care, very gingerly, and with some degree of bravery, at least, if one was going to question it publicly. Yet, I felt like I was dropped into a scenario where the actual level of racism against black people was pretty much as low as it gets anywhere on Earth. Like, we're talking about one of the most progressive zip codes on planet Earth. But the level of concern about racism was dialed up to 11. So I would read every single week in the campus newspaper about how there's white supremacy all over campus, and then I would go about my life as a black student just not seeing any of it at all. And I became curious about that. I was never interested in race per se, but I became curious about the disconnect between what I felt I was seeing and living every day as a black student on campus, which is pretty much no racism, and the narrative I was getting, which was racism everywhere. So, I was trying to understand the psychology of what is going on here, right? What is going on here where we have the most privileged students on planet Earth, claiming to, talking like my grandparents would have been right to talk about growing up in the Jim Crow South. So what's going on? And that was really my doorway into it. I, started writing for myself first, and then I tried to write for the campus newspaper, which didn't like me very much, and eventually started writing for a magazine called Quillette, and that was the beginning of my career.
Thank you. Sort of on that note, I think today a lot of people would, we associate, as you said, the MLK ethic, right, as a very liberal progressive idea. Do you think that, the people nowadays who are pushing back against that sort of way of viewing race or viewing racism are coming from the right, as perhaps would have been traditionally thought of, or do you think it is coming from even more progressive people who are saying that either it's not progressive enough what MLK was saying, or maybe his views were mischaracterized? I'm just sort of interested in, like you said, coming from a rather liberal progressive town, Montclair, and then leaving, and it's sort of like people push back against that idea. So I'm curious where you think that comes from politically.
Well, it definitely, in the past 10 years, has mostly come from the left. There's always, and I think always will be, a part of the right that is just straight up racist from a white supremacist point of view. And so they have always and will always disagree with the ethic of what I call colorblindness in the book. But I think to most sane Americans at this point, white supremacy it's a wolf in wolf's clothing, which is to say, if you can't tell that the Ku Klux Klan is like not creating a blueprint for a good society, then at this point I can't really help you. But the thing about the progressive pushback against colorblindness is that it's a wolf in sheep's clothing, which is to say it's a very tempting and seductive ideology that good, smart, sane people can really be seduced by. And so I think that's why I spend a lot more time worrying about the latter than the former. In general, the pushback on colorblindness from the left argues that colorblindness is basically a Trojan horse for white supremacy. It's a surrender in the face of racism. It's like a do-nothingism about racism. It's pretending that racism doesn't exist. These are the arguments I usually hear. In my view, colorblindness is not pretending racism exists. It's rather a particular philosophy about what racism is and how to fight it, right? It's simply saying that that we're not going to pretend not to notice race, right? Of course, we all notice race. Like, you can tell that I'm not a Chinese woman, right? And so it's not pretending not to notice race. It's we all notice race. However, we're going to do our very best I'm going to do my very best to treat you without regard to your race. Whenever it matters, to not treat you differently on account of your race. And I'm going to ask you to do the same. And we're both going to ask the state, the government, not to treat us differently on account of race. And wherever societal inequities need to be balanced and corrected for, that be done on the basis of class and socioeconomics, which is, at the end of the day, a much better proxy measure for disadvantage than racial identity. So that's the version of colorblindness I defend. As for Martin Luther King, it's a kind of routine that happens every Martin Luther King Day, where basically the same exact article, the words are rearranged, but it's been written like 30 times, which is Martin Luther King was really a radical, right? And the subtext of that article is that Martin Luther King really would have agreed with the tone and spirit of Black Lives Matter, for instance. He was really a lot more about black identity politics, muscular identity politics, than we've been made to think. And his message has been watered down and sanitized in order to, make him out to be a kind of a more, let's say, I don't know, just a more passive figure, right? And what these articles do is they do a very kind of clever bait and switch where you're like, okay, Martin Luther King was a radical. What's your evidence for that? Oh, well, he opposed the Vietnam War before it was cool, which is true. He believed in universal health care and a bunch of like Bernie Sanders type economic policies. And then I'm asking, like, but hold on, where's the evidence that he was a radical in the way you're describing on the issue of racial identity. And there's none. Like he wrote a lot of books, he did a lot of speeches. I encourage people to go back and look at it. He never wavered on the idea of your race is fundamentally not a meaningful part of who you are. And all of his quote unquote radical stuff was either Vietnam War opposition, totally valid perspective, and he was, I think, early on it and brave to speak out about it. And Bernie Sanders style, healthcare policies, which whatever you think of that has nothing to do with really identity politics. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Well, that leads very excellently into the next question, which is, obviously you mentioned in your previous answer about how in The End of Race Politics you discuss the concept of color blindness, right, as something that perhaps we ought to strive for, something that's related to the MLK ethic. What I'm sort of wondering is, how did we then go from the MLK ethic as being the accepted norm and standard to now people seem to want to reject colorblindness through initiatives like, diversity, equity, inclusion policies at whether it be universities or businesses or within the government itself. Where do you think that shift necessarily took place in a kind of a historiographic sense?
Okay, so I think there's two stories. One is a story of the 60s and 70s, and one is a story of the past 10 years. I think, so in the early 60s, you get this brief consensus among American elites riding on the rhetoric of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, that colorblind legislation is the way to go. And you get the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is a totally colorblind act, and you get the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and so forth. And so you get this brief moment where people, frankly, on both sides of the political aisle, agree that we have to make this country colorblind with respect to the law. And then what happens? What happens is you have riots all over the country, not in response to this, but chronologically just after the long hot summer of 1967, where you just have cities like Newark and Detroit just absolutely destroyed by riots in ways that you can actually still see in those cities today. And so you have mostly black people rioting, and a lot of people look at this and they say, but hold on, we just ended Jim Crow. We just had this massive national reckoning around race. Why is it that right now, of all times, you have the worst riots we've ever had as a country from the black community? And so in response to that, a lot of people begin to think, well, colorblindness clearly isn't enough. We need to go further. We need race-based policies. We need to be hiring black police chiefs because they're black. We need to be doing a lot more, right? And this is when you get the beginning of reverse discriminatory policies and the beginning of affirmative action style policies as a response to the riots, really. So that's the first part of the story. I mean, I'll say one more thing about that is just, whereas the civil rights movement transformed the South, the riots, almost all of them happened in the North. So to view the riots as the civil rights legislation failing, I think was not quite the right analysis, but it was an understandable one at the time. And then I think the part of the story that everyone in this room is old enough to have lived through is basically, if you look at the data from around the time I was born, like 96 until 2012, race relations just got better every single year after the last. So by 2012, by the beginning of Obama's first term, a majority of all Americans of every race said that race relations were good, including black people, right? And that was a trend that had been going in that direction every year for 20 years. Then right around 2012, you begin to see a nosedive where people believe race relations are bad, so that by 2020, the number of people that thought it was good had actually cut in half fully. All that progress was wiped out in a matter of 8 years. So the question is, what happened? Republicans like to blame Obama and Democrats like to blame Trump, but neither of them actually, I think, had anything to do with it. What actually happened is that 2012 and 13 was the year that everyone and their mothers was on Facebook. And this fundamentally changed the way that information spread. So, for example, say it's like 2005 and someone in Wichita, Kansas gets a 911 call that you know, whatever, somebody's robbing a liquor store, who knows. And the police show up and the suspect puts his hand in his pocket, takes something out that's black, the police shoots. Turns out it's just a wallet or a phone, right? How do you find out about that in 2005? What happens with the story? Well, what happens is maybe it makes the local news. It's like on Wichita 7, and it makes the Wichita paper the next day after a journalist has had a chance to ask the cops' perspective on what happened and the family's perspective, and that's probably it. Let's say that exact same thing happens in 2012 or 13. Now what happens? Well, what happens is probably a bystander starts recording it on this new thing called a smartphone, the camera phone, and they probably start recording halfway through so that they miss the context, the first half of the interaction, right? And within minutes, they upload it to Facebook where it's gotten millions of views, made the rounds, been shown due to the algorithm precisely to the people that will be most angered by it, because that's what the algorithm does, and with zero journalistic context creation, right? So that is a total sea change in how we all receive information. It changed. It was as important, you know, maybe as the printing press. And so in that new media information landscape, people become convinced that it is open season on cops killing black people. And this was the genesis of the Black Lives Matter movement, of course. And you know, what people are seeing these videos circulating and understandably forming this impression, what they don't realize is that actually in raw numbers, more white people get killed by the cops every year. You just don't see it. You can look the videos up on YouTube, of course, if you're so inclined, but everyone's heard of George Floyd. No one heard of Tony Timpa, who was a white guy that died almost exactly in the same way, all caught on camera. And so it was a seen and unseen problem. We were all seeing videos when it happened to black people, but we weren't seeing any of the videos of it happening to white people. And so in that context, people became very open to these ideas that had long percolated in the academy, like critical race theory, which argue that white supremacy is fused into the very nature of the country, right? Only because of that context were people so ready to receive these ideologies that had existed for 50 years. And so I think that's the second part of the story of how colorblindness came to be seen as naive and backwards and so forth.
Well, thank you for that analysis. You mentioned earlier how social justice or, you know, DEI, critical race theory, is a bit of a wolf in sheep's clothing, suggesting that there are, you know, it's a nice facade to conceal something that's a bit more insidious underneath. So I'm just curious what you think have been, you know, if there have been, what the benefits of, you know, social justice have been in society, what you think the best examples in the past 10 years of like a good social justice movement have been, and what do you think has been the worst example of something that got totally out of hand and missed the point?
It's a little hard for me to say what good has come out of social justice. Well, let me put it this way. Racism is a real thing, and black people, you know, day to day are like, you know, racial profiling is a real thing. Cops are more likely to pull over a black person because they're black. Black teenagers get followed in stores and accused of stealing when they actually didn't, right? Like that happens more if you're black. That's real, and to be aware of that is a good thing. To make people aware of that is a good thing. So I can't say that the social justice movement has been all that effective almost on any of its goals, really. But generally making people aware of racism, I think that's a laudable, definitely a laudable goal. I would say the greatest harm caused by social justice measurably is what happened in 2020. I mean, what happened in 2020 ultimately is that there was a mass movement, a mass protest movement based around a myth that that it's open season on killing unarmed black people, right? And it was understandable because of how gruesome the George Floyd video was that people would react this way. But the result was that 2020 saw the greatest increase in the homicide rate in the history of the country, or in at least 100 years, okay, in a single year. And crime went up to a degree that black communities suffered from disproportionately. And nobody wants to talk about that. Nobody wanted to talk about the fact that actually, yes, you need the police. Sorry, you need the police. If you get rid of the police, if you defang the police, if the police force shrinks by 30, 40% like it did in some cities, crime will go up, and it won't be the wealthy people, the well-to-do people that on Yale's campus that suffer, because wealthy people by definition can use their wealth to avoid such nasty consequences, right? It will be the people, it will be poor people, it will be black people that suffer from this, and it was. And that's what happened, and progressives largely didn't care about it because the priority was hurting the police more than actually helping black people. At the height of 2020, at the height of the protests, Gallup asked black Americans, do you want more police in your neighborhood, less police, or the same amount? 80% said either same or more, leaving only 20% of the black community agreeing with the BLM's premise that the police needed to shrink. And of course, there's obvious reason for this is because black people rely on the police disproportionately. Because, yes, black people, both commit and suffer crimes at higher rates than most other communities. So in terms of the tangible harm, I mean, to me, the greatest year-over-year spike in the homicide rate in American history should be at the top of the list.
I'll ask you one final question before we turn it over to the audience, and this one will be looking towards the future. Obviously, your book came out just last year, but a lot has changed since last year, since January 20th of 25. And we're in a new administration, the new Trump administration. And I'm curious how you think that shift will unfold between the Biden administration and the Trump administration over the next 4 years, as well as where the movement goes from here for making progress for black Americans. What is the kind of next step during a Trump administration for black America?
Well, yeah, so Biden, I don't think deep down he was into critical race theory or race-based policy all that much, but I do think the people around him were. And that's why, for example, during COVID, the emergency aid to restaurants was distributed on the basis of race and gender triage rather than on the basis of which restaurants needed it the most. Policies like this, which I feel are poison in a multiracial society, creating new victim classes all the time. Policies like that are not going to happen under the Trump administration, which is something I celebrate. There's a lot of other reasons to worry about a Trump administration, but on that issue, I think it's his executive orders have been perfectly in line with my values, and so I'm happy about that. As for the progress of black Americans, I think broadly it's not a zero-sum game. Like what benefits Americans in general, strong economy, good economic growth year over year, low unemployment, lowering crime. These benefit all Americans, and Black Americans are no exception. So that's the whole ball game right there. There's no all the cliches about how to achieve that are true. There's no magic pill so far as I'm concerned. But hopefully we can stay on the right track and course correct when we get off it.
Thank you. Well, thank you again for answering my questions thus far. We'd like to turn it over to the audience now. So my colleague George has the microphone, and if you have a question, just raise your hand and he'll pass it to you for a question.
Hi. Thank you, first of all.
It's for the camera. It's on.
Okay. So you seem to be developing a critique of social media when it comes to allowing for misinformation to spread during the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm wondering if you would also apply the same logic to other potential sources of misinformation for social media when it comes to vaccine efficacy, or if you believe that there's some sort of regulations that we should have when it comes to social media, in your point of view.
That's a tough question. Yeah, there's tons of misinformation on social media. I think right now, probably the bigger problem is, at least on Twitter, is right-wing misinformation. Since Elon took over, I think, like just a couple days ago, this thing is circulating about the federal government funneling millions of dollars to news organizations to get favorable coverage, and it's like you double click on it, it's just not true. But these things are spreading like wildfire right now. A lot of that, I think, is Elon's responsibility and fault. Though I think the community notes feature is a really good improvement. It's better than fact checking, and it's I think done a lot of good. I don't have the solution to fixing misinformation on social media. I do think the crowdsourcing model has worked better than fact checking, which is to say it's like all of your grade school teachers told you that Wikipedia is like not a trustworthy source, which is fine, but it's actually a lot more trustworthy than a lot of sources because there's adversarial editing. And community notes brought that logic to Twitter, which I think was a really good choice. So the more people can do that, use that model, I think the better things will be. But ultimately, there's no substitute for just good journalism and good media literacy. And don't believe everything you read. And I don't know, argue with your uncle at Thanksgiving.
If you're able to stand when you ask a question, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Great to meet you, Mr. Hughes. I'm curious to know your thoughts on how racial or race perception sometimes changes when we face a mixed racial identity. For example, mixed individual, half white, half black. Perhaps that latter half outweighs the other, and they're just considered black. Have you encountered this with as a mixed individual with your half Hispanic half Hispanic part?
Yeah, completely. I mean, I'm sure you're all aware that to a large extent, racial identity can be socially constructed, which is to say, in Brazil they had 100 different words for different kinds of mixtures of black and white and so forth, and in Haiti and in America, you could be an octoroon or a quadroon if these words for being a quarter or an eighth black, and the differences really mattered in certain cases, legally and socially. And today we have norms that would look equally weird to an alien from outer space, right? If you were to explain to a Martian why is Barack Obama black, kind of tough, right? His mother was white, his father was African. Why is he black as opposed to biracial or mixed? Who knows? It's kind of just an arbitrary choice that we make that seems very real to us. So it's always good to be reminded of how contingent these categorizations can be. I mean, the category of Hispanic is totally ridiculous and meaningless. The category of, like if if you're born on either side of the Pakistani border, right? If you're born in Afghanistan, you count as Caucasian technically, but if you're born 10 miles over the border in Pakistan, you're Asian. That can matter when you're applying to college, for instance, right? My view is that we should just get out of this business. It's arbitrary. It's stupid, and you know, it's something we should just stop.
Thank you for coming out this afternoon. As one of the few black conservatives at Yale Law School, I routinely find myself in very interesting, sometimes heated discussions like the one that you had on The View. Mm-hmm. And this is less of a policy or, big picture kind of question, but I'm curious on a personal level, how do you still navigate these thorny conversations with adversarial kind of counterparties with poise and almost, I wish you would try to, fact check my facts, kind of attitude, both in the book, but then also when you go out and speak publicly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, my view is I genuinely do not dislike most of the people that disagree with me. I totally get why people disagree with me. And so I try to come into every conversation from a point of view of, like, I'm not trying to own this person. Like, even with Sunny Hostin on The View, she was totally hostile to me, but I also, I think if you come into a conversation feeling combative and feeling hostile, it's not going to be a good conversation. So I did not feel hostile to her. I explained why I thought she was wrong, but I see no point in coming into a mindset with a conversation with a fighting mindset. It could become a fight, and that's inevitable. But at the end of the day, people disagree. People disagree for all kinds of reasons, and they have their own experience and their own life story, which led them to their beliefs. So I think it helps to come at it with that perspective.
Okay, my question is about one of the solutions that you give in the last chapter of your book about blind evaluation processes. I mean, makes a lot of sense, like with respect to things like accountant, like if you're hiring an accountant, there are clear ways to measure that. This is a more practical question. But for something like college admissions, where things like personality or the degree to which that is maybe harder to separate from like a cultural upbringing and the certain values that sort of, not to say they aren't completely separable, but they're related. Like to what degree, I mean, how do you even go about doing blind sort of evaluation in these sorts of cases, or in politics, right, where sort of race or culture might play more into sort of what it means to be a good politician? Yeah, how do you think about having blind processes with respect to areas where sort of the measurement of whether or not somebody is qualified for it is much murkier?
Yeah, so I won't assume you've all read my book, but what and he got to the end of the book, which is great.
You all will soon.
Most people who read my book or read my book twice, like Sunny Hostin, they don't get to the last chapter. So well done. So, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit with potentially eliminating racial bias from systems, because whenever it was, I think it was in the 70s, orchestras started doing blind auditions, right? Because there was a lot of male judges that thought the female trumpet player, she just didn't really sound very strong. But then when they hear it without looking at her, she actually was the best, right? And so one of my recommendations was to institute blinding processes wherever it's practical, right? Some professors do this. I had a professor do this when they graded papers. It's like, you know, I'm not going to know whose paper I'm reading, right? And so that seems to me a low-hanging fruit way of getting rid of racial bias in certain systems. But it's just not practical in a lot of scenarios. In any scenario that's face-to-face, obviously it's completely impractical. So the short answer is like, don't do it. You can't do it in most scenarios. But in the scenarios where you can do it, it's something for organizations to think about if they really care about eliminating racial bias.
Thank you for coming and answering all of our questions. My question is within a similar vein of reasoning as Alex's, which is that we kind of have this tension between these two ethics. We have the older MLK ethic of colorblindness. We have the more recent critical race theory, like identity politics. Now, especially with globalization and the question of immigration being one of the most pressing for America right now, we have this large question of the values of different cultures and whether we have an ability to make value judgments as to whether one is better or not. This question comes up in the book. I didn't read the whole thing, I'm sorry, but I saw the appendix, and it seems like you're making an argument upon like kind of racial realist grounds. How far can this argument go and not contradict the like earlier MLK grounding? Is this okay? Is this a natural development of how we should think about race?
Sorry, wait, oh, hold on.
Sorry, I'm back.
So is what a natural development?
Or having an appendage to the original colorblindness that actually does account for the value distinctions between different cultural groups.
Oh, okay. So how do we, yeah, so I argue for color blindness, but not culture blindness. I think culture is incredibly important. There are differences between cultures, and not all cultures are equally good at creating flourishing societies. The same culture at two different points in time is not equally good, right? I think American culture used to be worse with respect to a lot of issues, right? You had, 50 years of lynch law in the South. Terrible, terrible feature of the culture, to say nothing of slavery and so forth. So it's not true that all cultures are equally good at everything, and we should have no preferences with respect to attributes of culture, with respect to customs, and so that's my big picture view. With respect to immigration and colorblindness, yeah, I guess I generally think that immigration is a good thing, but it should happen legally, and it should happen in an orderly way, and it should be brought within the bounds of democracy, which is to say, right now, the immigration to the country is controlled basically by whatever crisis happens in Central America, rather than by what the voters want. So I think generally, we have to have a border in order for immigration to be brought within the realm of democratic control. And my view is much closer to the libertarians than the conservatives. I think America should take in a lot of immigrants, but should do it in an orderly way.
Sorry, I've been like jumping up and down. It's a great pleasure to meet you. I've listened to your podcast for a long time. But I had two questions that are unrelated, so you don't have to answer both of them. The first one kind of leads on from what she said. If there are differences in cultures and you're taking in populations from different cultures, a lot of Trump's rhetoric has been based on like, we don't want people from like that culture, not necessarily even that race. We just don't want people from that culture in our country. And there's very similar rhetoric in South Africa, where I'm from. And I'm wondering how you square that with a need for immigrants, and the fact that most people who, like, America's a country made up of immigrants, so culture's a malleable thing. But how do you look at that without being racist, basically? That's the first question. The second question is, like, being in an institution like Yale, where a lot of the academia is defined by, like, who you got references from, and, like, people choose each other, and you have this idea really deeply embedded of, like, critical race theory. Every, like, different faculty has their critical race theory like inlet at Yale. How do you reverse on that trend if you think that it's not true? And if it is not true, and seeing as it's academia and people are researchers, how did it become so deeply embedded in places where people's whole job is to like do fact checking in one form or another?
Yeah, okay, so yeah, the first question is a very tough one, because on the one hand, there is like legitimate preferences for people from certain cultures and not others, right? It's like if you took in like millions of people from an Amish type culture, the country would be more Amish, right? And personally, I'm not really into that, right? They would change the character of the country fundamentally. If we took in 50 million, white evangelical Christians, the country and the politics of the country and the policies of the country would probably become a lot more evangelical, right? I'm also not super into that. So people could admit those thought experiments, but then if you're talking about a minority or a group of color that has a particular culture you don't want, all of a sudden the blood pressure goes up, and you begin to worry that you're being racist or that other people are being racist. So there's a totally legitimate conversation to be had about like what kinds of cultural values we want to import and which places subscribe to those cultures. And then there's just straight up racism, right? There's a lot of that on the right too. So teasing out the difference, I don't think there's an exact science of how you tease out the difference other than trying to be honest with yourself, trying to be honest in general. The guy working for Doge that tweets "normalize Indian hate." I don't know if you heard about this recently. Like that seems to me just like it's either a bad attempt at a joke or it's just straight up racist. But a person that in the UK worries about the number of Pakistani migrants that have come into the country and the problems that have come with that, it seems to me totally legitimate. So yeah, there's no exact method for teasing that out other than keeping the conversation going. Oh, sorry, there was a second part of your question, wasn't there? What was it?
Just like what's going to happen to places like this? And if this is
Oh, yeah, they're doomed, I think. I don't know. It's really hard. Once an echo chamber has been created, it's extremely hard to undo. It's one of those things like unscrambling an egg, where it's like way easier to scramble than to unscramble. So I'm not sure. Right now I'm teaching a course at the University of Austin, which is based on this thesis, sort of, that higher education is unsalvageable, and so new institutions need to be started because the legacy institutions can't be fixed. So I hope that's not true, but it could be. And the truth is that we're tribal creatures, and human beings are much usually only really produce true good research and insights in group settings where you have norms of like peer review and heterogeneous views. But also people hate that, because what people actually want is war, and we want to root for our team at the Super Bowl, and we're deeply wired for that, and that produces reliably the worst research. So it's a very difficult problem to get out of, and I think people at legacy institutions need to recommit to the idea of intellectual diversity. And like Yale's not going to produce the best research if it's 100 to 1 liberal to conservative. And it's not the liberals' fault. It's just that can't happen. There has to be more of a balance and more of a checks.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Rudy. I'm at the School of Management. I'm really liked your question there, and we're seeing like a real case study right now where a lot of private firms are removing their DEI initiatives. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what do you think that'll look like in the next 2 to 3 years, or at least during this administration, and do you think these efforts are genuinely meant to course correct or to just like appease the current administration?
I think they're mostly to appease the current vibe shift. But I nevertheless think they're a good thing in most cases. I think it was the New York Times had a great expose recently about the University of Michigan's DEI program and the results that it had. And it sort of reminded me about this old parable about British India. When the British ruled India, there was this problem with a particular kind of snake that was going rampant. And so they set up a policy where they would pay you X number of dollars to bring in a snake, figuring they would, this would be a good solution. And then people just started breeding the snakes for money. And that's essentially what DEI has been. Like, the idea is to, okay, we're going to hire some people to fight racism within the institution, but actually what happens is you just get way more like reports of racism because it gets defined down into meaninglessness, right? It like used to be, it's literally, we're talking about something that used to be a white guy yelling the N-word at a black kid, and now it's someone asking, where are you really from? Because it's obvious that your parents like were not born here, in total good faith, and now that's racism. So then you get a DEI bureaucracy that it's like no one actually knows what they're doing all day, because, right? If the janitors all left Yale's campus, you guys would notice within 2 hours because the plumbing would not things would stop working. If every DEI person didn't come to work, you might not notice for a very long time because it's not really clear what they do. And so I think a lot of companies are realizing, well, I guess they're allowed to realize it now because of the political shift, but who knows, it could shift back in another 4 years.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you about something that's maybe a little touchy, I'm not sure, about historically black colleges. Mm-hmm. And something that institutions that I would think people almost universally think right now are positive institutions. Mm-hmm. How would you be received there? And do you think that the students there are more or less racially conscious than if they were at a Yale?
So, I mean, my dad went to Howard, my sister went to Spelman. Both had good things to say about it. If you notice, of all the campus meltdown stories of the past 10 years, have any of them occurred at HBCUs? I honestly can't even think of one. And I think part of the reason for that is when everyone's black, you don't get any social brownie points for being blacker than the next person. And there's also no white people around to like feel guilty. So the social dynamics are completely different and don't incentivize or attract the same style of activism. Which is why you just like, you didn't hear of any woke campus meltdown stories really from HBCUs so much. So I really don't have any problem with HBCUs. I think, insofar as they're good schools, then they're good schools. And by the way, they don't legally exclude non-black people. There are white students that go to Howard. It's just understood that far fewer apply, and so I think I would have a problem if there were like a legal exclusion, but.
Thank you for coming here. I find it interesting that you mentioned the racist Doge post, Twitter poster. So his name is Marco Velez. Yeah. He went to my high school, and I somewhat knew of him. Like I was like I tangentially knew him, and knowing that generally like who goes to my high school, I I can like guarantee you that he had a lot of friends of Indian descent in high school, and he had a lot of people who he knew were of different races and religions, and generally people at my high school, at least I thought until I found out about Marco Velez, like got along despite these differences. And what this has made me kind of change, in my opinion, is like I'm now less confident that meeting people or interacting with people of a different race or of a different religion will make somebody who is racist less likely to be racist in the future. So can you or like do you have any thoughts on how we can change, like truly get under somebody and like change the mind of somebody who does hold prejudiced views? What kinds of contact or like what kinds of things can we say to them, or like what kinds of arguments can we make to a person to make them change these views?
That's a great question. There is a literature on this in political science asking the question, what kinds of social situations between races foster racism and its opposite? And what emerged from that is just like putting people in contact with each other with no other caveats doesn't necessarily work, could even backfire. Like, in the South, Southern whites had way more contact with African Americans than Northern whites did, but they were also extremely racist, right? So what emerged from that literature is basically what works is having people of different races socially interacting in the context where they're on the same status level and working together towards a common goal. So the example you should have in your head is like being on a sports team, right? We're on the same team, we're trying to win the tournament, and we're all on the same level, right? It's not like the white people are whatever on top of the minorities. We're all equal. So in those contexts, people's prejudices actually do melt away. The military can be like that in certain instances, which is why you have people come out of those situations basically like family with people of different races, for life. So the more people can meet other races in that context, the better.
I think we have time for one final quick question.
Thanks. I have one fanboy question and one more serious question. So the fanboy question is the podcast coming back, and when's the next rap video coming out? And the more serious question is, I think you had a great diagnosis of the impact that social media has had in terms of kind of ramping up the racial strife. But I wonder if you see maybe there's a precursor to that where there was sort of an infrastructure built up both in the academy and with like advocacy organizations early on to kind of fight racism. And once that had a positive effect, which resulted in the stories you told about the way you grew up, that infrastructure was still there and had to seek out new problems. And there's sort of this tendency to kind of like search for new problems until you find an insurmountable one, like systemic racism. Like we're always going to have disparate outcomes, so that's a problem you can always fight, right? Mm-hmm. And I think maybe there's a little parallel to the environmental movement. Like once we cleaned up the air and the water, we got to keep looking for new problems to fight, so we end up on climate change, which we're never going to fix. And so I just wondered if you see that as sort of a precursor that kind of set the stage for the social media stuff that you described, or if that's sort of like off base.
Yeah. So to the first questions, I don't know, and I don't know, and then. To the second question, this is an inherent problem with the structure of advocacy organizations. It's a structural problem. It's not about the specific people. When the NAACP was founded, black people couldn't vote in the South, and it had a clear mission, and it did amazing work during the Civil Rights Movement, did very important work. Once that work is accomplished, organizations don't just say, let's close up shop. We did it, boys, right? What they do is they exist forever. So like there's one famous example of some kind of like, I forget what it's called, maybe you've heard it. It's like a charity for like Scottish people that was established like hundreds of years ago. and still exist to this day for like specifically like Scottish welfare or something. But the organizations don't declare their own irrelevance ever. And so now, like the NAACP is declaring, is issuing travel advisories to states, like seriously, with a straight face, telling black people they should not visit the state of Florida because of something annoying Ron DeSantis said. Like literally issuing a travel advisory as the U.S. government would issue if there was like Ebola in the Congo. So it's become a total like joke, but this is an inherent problem with organizations. I don't know what the solution is, because you do need good advocacy organizations, and for their useful lifetime, they're very good things, and then I think they just become like a ghost of themselves at a certain point.
Well, on that note, that concludes our program for today. So if you'll all join me again in thanking Mr. Coleman Hughes.
Thank you. All right.